Reverend, thank you very much. And, you know, when Reverend was asked to serve on the Bicentennial Commission, that should not be a surprise to anybody, because any project in our community that requires some energy, enthusiasm, and boostership has to include Reverend Robert Lawrence and this congregation. They always open their doors to us, and please give them all a wonderful round of applause. Reverend, thank you. When we spoke at one of the commission meetings about the potential for a lecture series, I don't think any of us envisioned the level of participation that we see here tonight, that we saw here last week, and it warms the heart to know that this is a community that respects its history. For all of the wonderful things that we have planned for the future, if we don't respect that history, preserve it, and talk about it and embrace it, then indeed we are left without a soul. And so we're very, very pleased to see this level of participation tonight and in the weeks to come. And certainly Fall River, as it celebrates its bicentennial, does so as a community that probably best represents the American experience, as people have come here from all over the world, looking for opportunity, looking to form a community. And tonight we're going to hear very much about what Fall River's history, and in particular its people, is all about. And I think that many of us agree that the heart and soul of this community is its people. The people who came here looking to provide for their families, and in doing so brought with them a work ethic that was second to none. And so I've always believed that our city's future is bright because the people here care very deeply about what the future holds for us. I'm very heartened by seeing all of you here tonight, and it's my distinct pleasure to introduce our guest speaker. In another time and place, I might refer to him as Fall River's own Dr. Phil. But what I prefer to do, just to give you a little more detail, even though he's no stranger to us, is to let you know that Sylvia is a native and lifelong resident of Fall River. He received his undergraduate degree from Providence College, his master's and doctorate from Fordham, and has been a member of the faculty at Bridgewater State College since 1968. He is known by many of us for his involvement in this community, in historical preservation, and in his ability to help relay to us the great and proud history of our city, whether it be with his 3-volume study, Victorian Vistas, or his sharing of his doctoral dissertation, The Spindle City, Labor, Politics, and Religion in Fall River, Massachusetts, 1870 to 1905. So we are very blessed to have someone of his credentials care so deeply about the city and help us preserve that which we know is very important in terms of maintaining our soul. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Philip Sylvia.
Thank you. You've brought honor to Fall River and your turnout tonight, and I'm very pleased that Reverend Lawrence has been so cooperative in assisting me preparing for tonight. Ed Lambert's been special to me in terms of his interest in history. He's one of the few people that asked to read both volumes of my doctoral dissertation and completed the task, which is even more challenging. So I do appreciate that. Hills, mills, stills, and pork pies. Now, speaking of pork pies, there are 200 available to one of the winners of the Historical Society raffle. But beyond the pork pies, I'd rather focus first on that word hills. Back around 1980, my Uncle Paul Dunn and several other physicians at Truesdale Clinic put together the Bud Pierce 10-mile road race. And the guru of running at that time, beyond Bill Rogers, people over 40, was a Dr. Sheehan. And so we were delighted that Dr. Sheehan came to participate in one of the Bud Pierce races. The only problem was no one told him the course directions. And he was fine going along North Main Street. That was about mile 7. And then he had to take a left, and there's a place called Wilson Road. And so he ascended Wilson Road, and then he looked right. And there's what we call the Catholic Memorial Hill. That was his next challenge. So he was a great runner, and he finished. And I got to speak to him in the cool-down period, and he basically said to me that in my entire career, pride has prevailed over pain. But if there was another hill, the top of that second one, it was going to be pain over pride, and he was going to stop. Well, as you know, my title tonight talks about pride. But I have to say right at the beginning, in a somewhat negative way, that realistically in our history, often pain has overwhelmed pride. And pride can be hurtful. Pride that's misused can be hurtful. And I think that we were challenged early on because we were coming from all places in the world, and we were trying to learn to like one another, and it wasn't an easy task. The results, if we can put down the lights perhaps at this point. The result was a lot of terrible stereotyping, and it was so commonplace that you could run an ad like that and try to sell soap of a black woman as a scrub woman. And I thought that this was amazingly offensive from our perspective, that you would have a perfect Anglo child and a stereotypically less than perfect African-American child, and it was plain as black and white that you should go to Boyd the optician for your next pair of glasses. The national media would run articles in the 1890s, this is Popular Science Monthly, with the title, "What Shall We Do with the Dago?" And then it would go on to condemn the Italian immigrants in the country. I'm just using that by way of a background because I want to now get into a more positive perspective, and yet we'll connect the two tonight. The idea of give me your tide, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, I think leaves us with the impression that if you were an immigrant, you were poor. I mean, we sort of identify that. We think that America, the streets of gold supposedly, was the answer. What we have to understand is that it's true. The greatness of Fall River is there was no other immigrant city like it. We had a higher percentage of immigrants than any other city. And I do have something I would like to pass around, which you can place down later if you'd like. But if you have a chance to look at it, it gives you an example of how small a percentage of workers in the textile mills were native, born of native parents. So we establish ourselves then as the immigrant city. What I'd like to do is to sort of create two human bookends to the 19th century and use them to defy the stereotype of immigration and poverty, because both of these people were extremely successful, at least in a materialistic way. The first person I want to introduce, of course, is, and I've listed him on the board, Samuel Slater. Without Samuel Slater, none of our lives would be as they are, for better or worse. Samuel Slater was born in 1768, and in a sense, our 235th anniversary as a city might go back to that birthday, because Samuel Slater made a fortuitous decision. He came after training in the forefront of the Industrial Revolution to New York. The city of Philadelphia was offering, through Alexander Hamilton and others, incentive for skilled textile workers to leave England with treasured secrets. Slater was one of those people who had trained under Jedediah Strutt and Joseph Arkwright. And those two gentlemen had developed the first spinning villages in England. He had apprenticed for some 6 years, and he was fanatically devoted to textile technology. Slater would spend 6 days as a teenager working in Strutt's mill, and then on the 7th day he would ask if he could be left alone for the duration of the day, and would spend it in the mill, studying the machinery and planning for improvements. So he was a catch, if you will. And so when he came here in 1790, his intention was to go to Philadelphia and take advantage of the bounty opportunity. He landed in New York, and he met a ship captain who suggested to him that he might consider an alternative. And that alternative was Providence, Rhode Island, because Moses Brown was interested in establishing a spinning factory in Providence, or if you will, Tucket, North Providence. And so it just turned out that way. I think if Slater had gone south to Philadelphia, the textile revolution would, at the very least, have been delayed in terms of coming to Fall River, or perhaps it would not have come to Fall River, and we would have remained at a rather rustic village, which would have kept nature's beauty about it, but would not have developed into the Industrial Revolution gem that it did become. At any rate, Slater certainly came to Fall River. We simply can't document when. But many of the people, the skilled artisans that trained at Pawtucket under Slater, did look for other opportunities, and the falls of the Quipashan were perfect. So some that were trained by Slater were involved in the evolution of our early mills, beginning in the second decade of the 19th century. So it must be marvelous, it would be marvelous to be able to sit with Slater and say, what was it like when you first saw this beautiful community? At any rate, Slater lived until 1835. He died as a millionaire. He owned some 12 corporate properties. He passed on his business to 3 sons who ran it very effectively into the end of the 19th century. So Slater is, again, an immigrant that came with a great deal of pride in himself. We have a picture of Slater, and I think there was always the confidence. There was always the confidence. When Slater wrote to Moses Brown, his original communication was, I flatter myself that I can give the greatest satisfaction in making machinery, making good yarn, as any person in England, as I have had the opportunity and an oversight at Sir Richard Arkwright's works. And so indeed, this is a person of great pride, who, in a sense, made our industrial foundations a reality. Now we go to that other human bookend at the end of the century. His name is William M. Wood. William M. Wood is a remarkable individual in American industrial history, and he's a person who also connects to Fall River. William Wood was described well into his career as supposedly the most important man in the woolen industry in the world. William Wood was not an important man early in his life. His father was a Portuguese cook on a whaling vessel. This Portuguese family established themselves on Martha's Vineyard in the 1850s and subsequently moved to New Bedford. In 1870, there were some 10 children, and William M. Wood's father died at the age of 43. So William Wood had to leave school, and I don't like to tell my students this, he then subsequently wrote, "This is when my good fortune began." He started as a bookkeeper in the Wamsutta Mill in New Bedford at $4 a week, and he studied diligently the practice of cotton textiles, and he moved forward from that point on. He eventually became a bookkeeper for the New Bedford Fall River Railroad, and then he ended up living in Fall River and being a paymaster at the Border City Mills for several years in the 1880s. In 1886, the city directory tells us that he left the city, removed to Lawrence. Indeed, William Wood was on the way up. He had met one of the most important of the old Yankee mill owners of Lawrence, and better than meeting him, he met his daughter. And so this is all part of the Horatio Alger legend. You work hard, but you also have a little bit of good luck along the way. Frederick Ayer's daughter said, "I do," at a certain point, and William Wood, in a sense, was about to inherit one of the most important mills in Lawrence. It's interesting then that this Portuguese immigrant lad was married to a woman of great refinement who had studied in France, was most cultured, had a degree from Radcliffe, and they did famously together. When Wood left Fall River, he had advanced to making $1,400 a year. By the time he worked for his father-in-law in Lawrence in the late 1880s, he was making $25,000 a year. He later put together the American Woolen Trust, and that consisted of some 26 mills. He also tried to put together the sum of that in my Victorian Vistas, a cotton trust, but the stockholders in Fall River chose not to sell out. At any rate, this is why he was becoming the most important woolen manufacturer, which was the specialty of Lawrence in the world. By 1905, he put up a factory in Lawrence that he humbly named the Wood Mill, and it ran for a third of a mile, and at its peak employed 10,000 people. William Wood continued to enjoy extraordinary success. In 1 year, on the eve of World War I, his income for the year was $978,000. So, again, I think these two stories help us to defy the stereotype. It's also interesting, though, that Wood left behind, shed the skin of his ethnicity, because in 1900 he told the census takers that his father had been born in Scotland, and his mother, who was still living, said that she had been born in Massachusetts, which was not true. She had been born in the Azores. So it's interesting that as this man succeeded, that in a sense he covered up his background. The period in between, we need to talk about pride in a different sense, because none of the immigrants we're going to talk about tonight had the kind of income level or material success that these two gentlemen did. But did they have pride? I'm leaving to Mary Blewett, who's a splendid research historian, the opportunity to speak about mill life, as you know she will be in a couple of weeks. But one of the things that Mary will probably focus on, as she does in her book Constant Turmoil, is the fact that women led the one great textile strike that was successful in the 19th century in early 1875. And yet the challenge to have success can be seen if we look at something simple I did. I decided to look at the weather patterns during that strike. And I know from the advantage of certain parts of the room you may or may not be able to see this, but it's instructive without my reading all of it. But there were just a series of problems beginning, especially in February. The strike had begun in January, and it would last into March. But if you think of what people that were out of work were living through, you just look at the situation. The old steamer, Quickershan, used to thaw out the frozen hydrants. This is amazing. The Florida Skating Club will meet at Rodman's Wharf. And they intend to tempt the bay as far as Stone Bridge. So the level of thickness, the ice on the river near Slate's Wharf measured 15 inches thick. Skating on both the bay and the river is excellent. So imagine how cold it was. The efforts to cut through ice by Staples and Phillips was abandoned. The storm, another driving snowstorm all night, high winds, and basically the railroads were blocked in all of this attempt. And the story continues like that. And finally, we have statistical data that shows that indeed this had been a miserable time. Using a diary from Samuel Rodman, they calculated that there was only one day in January of 1875 where the temperature reached 36.5 degrees. But the overall average for both January and February was 21.67, the number one coldest winter in Fall River history to that point in time. A sad story, the steamer Richard Borden leaves Providence and ends up being grounded because of an ice flow. A man jumps overboard and leaves 8 children behind on the Richard Borden. The difficulties of the time. And as we finally started to have a little bit of a thaw, it must have still been nasty. Celebration on 3/17, the Irish finally got themselves outside. Celebration of St. Patrick's Day. the mud everywhere, and in some places aggravated by the frost coming out of the ground and rendering pedestrianism one of the difficult arts. So sometimes we have to connect in history and to realize that what temptation there might have been, right, not to pursue the strike or to call it off because of the forbidding conditions. But they did not. And so there's that tenacity, and I see that tenacity with workers throughout the 19th century. Many of you were involved, as I was, with the expo some 20 years ago at Fairfield High School library, and there were a lot of activities going on. If you recall, we converted the library basically into a historical museum, and it was too bad we had to break it down, wasn't it, after a week. But among the things that were going on, as you walked in, some of you may recall, there was a very simple machine. And there was a Jim Dias, who I befriended, who was operating the machine. He was a technician at SMU at the time. And it was a stocking machine. It was making stockings. And it was a simple machine, and yet it was fascinating to watch the process. And everybody stopped along the way to look at this machine. And I can remember so many proud grandfathers with their children talking about, this is the kind of product that I was able to work on in my life, and this is the kind of machine that we used. And so I think sometimes we forget, and sometimes there's a tendency to lump textile workers as unskilled lint heads. But there was a great variety of work needed within a mill. And some of it demanded tremendous skill. And of the two highest vocations, the most important, as I've listed on the board, were the loom fixers and the mule spinners. Now, almost all of the mule spinners and loom fixers came from England, though many of them, in fact, were Irish-born, though they stopped off in Lancashire before arriving in Fall River. This is one of the pictures of my mother-in-law, Kay Halloran's dad right here, Sam Taylor, and his father, also Sam Taylor. And again, a strong loom fixer tradition. The British were very proud, the English were very proud of their ethnicity in Fall River. The loom fixers hall was one where people would gather proudly. And most of you went by it as you came in and sat down, but I'd ask you to please look, for the sake of the Fall School Department, who worked very hard to get this material artifact here tonight. But we have a loom fixer's case in the back of the room. And so during the break, please take the chance to look at this. It was contributed in 1897. A number of years ago, I was doing Union Hall research, and I kept looking at that from a distance, and finally the person that was in charge of the hall said, come on over and look at this more closely. And that case demonstrates the pride that I'm talking about. That's all of the instruments that a loom fixer would have had to use to repair the weaving machines. And just by the complexity of it, you know that they were skilled. More remarkably, if you look closely, these are not real tools. The person that did contribute to that case had such talent and such pride that he carved each piece of the case contents, and then he painted them to look metallic. And so I can't better point to anything than that as a proof of the pride that we're talking about. Now, historically, the most significant group in terms of pride were the mule spinners. Mule spinning was a complex process. It started to evolve with the spinning jenny, where you go beyond the spinning wheel. And I've mentioned his name before, but the person that brought this forward and was knighted for the effort was Sir Richard Arkwright. He worked very, very hard at developing a spinning machine, but he took time out for an occasional meal. And one of the people that was very interested in the evolution of the textile machinery was our own Fall Riverite, William C. DeVall. William C. DeVall was described as being worth more to Fall River for the 20 years succeeding the building of the Metacomet Mill than all the other Fall Riverites put together because of his improvements in cotton machinery. DeVall was remarkable. Born in 1806, he was the spinning overseer in the Troy Mill in 1819. You do the math. Born in 1806, he was the spinning overseer in 1819. He was, keep doing your math now, he was the superintendent in 1827 at age 21. In 1838, he and Major Bradford Durfee traveled to England to look at the new improved mule machine that had been developed by the firm of Sharp and Roberts. They wanted the machine, and yet again the same laws against export were a hindrance. So they were involved in international subterfuge. The company agreed to sell our Fall River gentlemen the machine, but they would have to figure a way to get it out of their property into the New World. So they met a person who was supposed to be skilled in the process, and they paid that person 70% up front and came home. 2 years later, they were still waiting for the product. And I'm sure they had become a little bit cynical about the prospects when suddenly this large box-like thin item emerged out of Le Havre, and it said glass on it, but it turned out to be the mule frame broken up into pieces. And so they carefully reassembled the pieces, and in 1840, practically everybody in Fall River came to observe the most sophisticated spinning machine in the world. They called it, because it was 1840, Tippy Canoe. This was the Tippy Canoe machine because in 1840, Harrison was running for president along with Vice President Tyler, and it was Tippy Canoe and Tyler too. And so that was the beginning. But you could bring a machine and you could replicate what they did in England, but you needed the skilled workers from England. And so the mule spinners began to arrive. And the mule spinners became the dominant union in Fall River in the 19th century. They were skilled, they were proud. Their motto was defense, not defiance. They did not look to strike, but they would if necessary. We have some great pictures of Fall River mule spinners. This is from one of the postcards that many of you may have seen. One of the more interesting aspects of this is mule spinners with bare feet. And I just want to remark on that in a minute. The mule spinners were also assisted by so-called back boys, and usually it was a father and son combination. This was a real craft union, and you sort of passed heritage through family. The mule spinners worked arduously. The machine on rollers would back off to the aisle, and it would be pulling the yarn, and then it would stop and it would twist the yarn as it went back. And it would be done alternately, so there'd always be one machine out of the aisle and the other one back up against the carriage. So the mule spinners worked and worked hard. Tom Cottrell, I told you I'd mention your name, Tom, presented this to the Historical Society time ago. It was given to him. And again, this is, Tom, this may be 2 by 2, perhaps. This is an application to join the Cotton Spinners Association of America. And it was in all different colors. I mean, just the application itself shows how proud these people were. And when you look at some of the detail, this would be what a typical mill spinner would look like. Crompton was the person that had perfected the mule beyond Arkwright. And so, mule spinner, backboard. These people worked 60, 70 hours a week, depending on the time. The windows were never open in the summer because you did not want the thread to be brittle and to break. I think another person that sort of represents the spirit of this is Samuel Watson, who gives us the bells and the school on his property. And when I do jog through Oak Grove Cemetery, and what I do love is that when you get to their gravestone, it's in the early 20th century, and they're so far ahead of the times. In a male chauvinistic age, the wording on the gravestone is Betty and Sam. And then I love the statement above it, in this world we jogged along together. But Sam Watson had been a mule spinner who became an overseer, who became a successful entrepreneur and had his own mill, and then contributed greatly to Fall River that he was most proud of. Now, these people, as I said, were our best workers, and they were compensated accordingly. And this would be an example then. How far back can this be read? I don't have a sense of who can read this. But look at the names. And because we're from Fall River, if I did this in Bridgewater, people say, I don't know. But I mean, we identify people by names, right? So we can tell. So it's Morris and Harrop and Taylor and Seal and Ross and Smithies. Who are we talking about ethnically? English, right. And then we throw in some more on that particular room. Again, Sanderson, Mott, Crossley, Langfield. Okay? Now these people did piecework, and at the very best, if I go back to this, you could make $14 a week. But many of them were in a $12 to $14 category. And that's just something to keep in mind in terms of where we're going. Now, the issue that bothered the mule spinners in time was twofold. One was the number of hours that had to be worked, and the other was the question of child labor. Fall River had its problems, I think, as we look back, in terms of not being socially progressive at the end of the Civil War. On a given day in the 1860s, about 60% of the kids never attended school. Now, by the middle of the 1870s, there were new labor laws passed. But even then, in 1875, on a given day, there was about a 50% absenteeism rate from school. The other issue was, how many hours should you work? And the mule spinners pushed for a new law that became a state law. And really, the Fall River textile operatives deserve credit for this. And the new law said, as of 1874, that women and children could only work a maximum of 60 hours per week. And that was an advance. Now, you might not think it's a great advance, but one woman, described as an Irish widow, obviously did. Because they had calculated that prior to this law, the typical time consumption in terms of getting ready to go to work and get home was about 77.5 hours per week. Now, this woman was gaining a little bit of time, and she talked about in this way, why the extra quarter hour at noon gives me time to mix my bread. And then when I comes home at night at 6 o'clock, it is ready to be put in pans, and I can do that while Katie sets the table. And after supper and the dishes are washed, I can bake. And then I am through and ready to go to bed, maybe before it's quite 9 o'clock. Oh, it's splendid. The best thing that's ever happened. I used to be up way into the night baking. After my works by a day's work in the mill. So this was splendid. She could be to bed by 9 o'clock now, getting ready for the next day. Well, despite the success that the mule spinner might have, it depended on what your specific circumstances were. Thomas O'Donnell that I've listed along with Senator Henry Blair is the next point that we have to deal with. In 1883, a national congressional committee came to Fall River, and they took testimony. There had been a terrible railroad strike in 1877 that had unnerved Americans. And suddenly there was this concept that there's a lot of social and labor tension. What's it all about? And so the Senate held these hearings, and they sort of went out into the field. They moved around, and they came to Fall River. Senator Blair was an extremely sensitive marble owner. He owned a marble quarry. He was a millionaire, but he was terribly disturbed by some of the social unrest, and he wanted answers. When he chaired the committee in Fall River, several important Fall Riverites predictably testified. But toward the end, the head of the Mule Spinners Union said, if you want to get it right, you have to also talk to the workers. And because of that intervention, Thomas O'Donnell, mule spinner, spoke, and when the testimony was printed 2 years later, it has become a wonderful, wonderful, rich resource for historians such as myself. Thomas O'Donnell's story is not a pleasant one, and yet he claimed there were probably 1,000 families in his circumstances. The circumstances were pitiful. He was what you would call a sick-duty mule spinner, and that would be the equivalent of being a substitute teacher. You hoped that a regular mule spinner would miss a day of work so that you could take over the mules. What you would have to do, though, you would have been getting a phone call, come in and sub. You would have to pick a mill, stand at the gate before 6 o'clock, and hope that someone was absent, and hope that you were the first one and that you would be picked. What you needed, as I said before, though, was a backboy. And because of the new laws, you needed someone who was 10 years of age, or at least you were supposed to be 10 years of age. And so when O'Donnell testifies, maybe he has a future. But the problem is, though he has 2 sons, one of them is 3.5 years old, and one is 1.5. Now, Thomas O'Donnell tells Senator Blair and the rest of the committee that in the previous year, his total income was $133. Okay. Now, how did you live, Mr. O'Donnell? Not very well, sir. And then he goes on to explain how he does survive. And he said that we hardly ever have a piece of meat during the course of the year. And when we do, it's a cheap slab of corned beef, which again, we associate with the Irish immigrants, but basically that was because it was the most inexpensive cut of meat at the time. The 2 kids seldom went outside because though they each had a pair of shoes, they were odd shoes, and they had holes in the bottom, and there were holes in the stockings. He said that they got along best in the summer because they could berry and they could go clamming. But the winter was very difficult. And at the end, after telling this harrowing tale, the senator says, you know what, you should leave Fall River. Now, we've got a Homestead Act, and if you just go west, we, the government, provide you with 160 acres of land. If you'll just work it for 5 years, it's yours for free. So why don't you just get your family out there, set up, just build a modest little home, plant the crop, and as soon as you harvest it and sell it, you'll be on your way to a new and presumably much better life than you've left behind, okay? And then he says, and Mr. O'Donnell, probably would have cost you more than $1,500 to do all of this. And the response is, sir, I've never seen more than a $20 bill at once. So Blair was not trying to be insensitive. It's just that even a sensitive person that was affluent couldn't quite comprehend the type of difficulty. But the interesting thing is that even in the worst of circumstances, we see a piece of pride. Question: how many dresses has your wife got? Answer: she has got one since she was married, and she hasn't worn it except when she is going to church and coming back. She is very good in going to church, but when she comes back, she takes it off, and it is pretty near as good now as when she bought it. So again, I think that gives us a sense of pride. Now, Henry Oliver and Carol Wright. These were both important political figures in Massachusetts after the American Civil War. They were both Civil War heroes, General Oliver, Major Wright. And Carol Wright did something that was very, very significant. He gives us the answer to the question of, okay, somebody made $133 in a year. What will that buy? You know, maybe $133 would buy a fine home. Probably not, as you can suspect. But what happened was, Henry Oliver was a reformer of the first persuasion, and he wanted to create an organization that would help the people of Massachusetts to better understand the working class. In 1869, the MBSL was created, the Massachusetts Bureau of Statistics of Labor. It was the very first in America, and it would soon be emulated within a dozen years by a dozen other states. So once again, we were the forerunner to reforms. But Henry Oliver had a problem. He was trying to enforce, as the factory inspector of the state, our school laws. And he was particularly dismayed that the school laws were being universally violated here in Fall River. He ended up having a very difficult time with Fall River management, and they with him. The management thought that he was a meddler, and there was great friction as this agency got underway. And it looked like it was doomed for extinction because management was exerting good pressure on the political system, and the governor had a decision to make. And he made sort of a compromise decision. He removed Wright, which satisfied management, and he brought in a more objective person in Carol. He removed Oliver, rather, and he brought in a more objective person in Carol Wright. But Carol Wright was a person who, right from the beginning, would say, the old school always asked, will it pay? The higher query is it right? And so what he did was he made himself into the most brilliant statistician in the United States and perhaps the world. He became, in good time, the president of Clark University, but before then, he was the head of the United States Federal Bureau of the Census and Labor Bureau. So again, the fame that he began to achieve in the 1870s is what catapults him to even greater fame. Now, in 1875, in the 6th annual report under Wright's supervision, his agents were sent out to industrial communities, including Fall River. And they did something that was spectacular for the time. They developed a very precise and complex way of looking at the cost of living. How much would it cost to live? And that's why by 1883, the senators certainly understood how much $133 was. Because what they did was, they took some 381 families and they asked all sorts of questions. And then they described the living conditions of their tenements and things of this nature. What what they determined, among other things, was that you needed $555. That would be the poverty line. That's what a family had to make if you had mom, dad, nuclear family, 2 to 3 children. Okay, you needed $555 to be at the poverty level. What was also revealed, was very interesting, is how basic things were. 55% of that income would go to food purchasing. 16% would go to clothing. Basically, as you added up, about 95% of all spending by a family was for very elemental food, clothing, shelter. And then there would be very, very little left over if you were at the poverty line. You'd be having a difficult time at the poverty line deciding whether you should spend that 2 or 3 cents to entertain yourself with a newspaper. All right? You would have no savings. You would have no money in reserve for a medical or other type of emergency, but at least you'd be surviving, okay? Now, the other thing that I think was important they did was they broke down income by ethnicity. And they took a group of foreigners and a group of Native Americans, and they said, this is what people make. Now, overall, at the time, the median income for a family was a couple of $100s above the poverty line. But when you get to communities such as ours, it was a more difficult situation. The top families were from Scotland, $790 a year, and then from England, 700, or from America, the United States, 720. And then the English would be in the 600 category. And then you get down into the 400s, and you were dealing with the Irish at the time, and also the French Canadians. So the French Canadian immigrants, the heads of household were making, according to this 6th annual report, $385 a year. That was what you could expect, $385 a year. The challenge then, obviously, was what? What had to happen? You had to go to the family wage system. Okay? There was no option. There was no option other than the family wage system. Now, the problem was that coming from the farms of Canada, the French population had no experience with women outside in the marketplace. It just didn't happen. So initially, when this study occurred, none of the mothers and wives were working. And what that meant was that children were, okay? And so, again, we begin to get into the reality that if you want to survive, you have to have children working. And what would happen would be, if you had one child working, that child would make a couple of $100s a year. If you had 2 children working, the younger one coming in wouldn't make quite as much. You could depend on making about $385 a year. So in other words, 2 children and the family would get themselves above the poverty line. And so children were the key to getting ahead in many cases. And if you had a whole slew of children, as many French families did, there could be economic security in time. It depended what stage of life people were at. It could be terrible if you had 5 or 6 kids and none of them were 10 years of age. But if you reach that point, and in all my notes, somewhere I have a chart which is really interesting of one family that had, I think it's 9 children in the cotton mills between the ages of 12 and 21. They were making it. So that's how people could get ahead. But more importantly, I think, if we can look at the Franco-American community as sort of the model community that maybe people are trying tenaciously from that community to hold on to this very precious culture. But in the last generation, we've come right to identify Fall River more as a Portuguese community. And when we think of Emerald Lagasse, we think of Portuguese food. We don't think so much of the French dimension of that individual. But Fall River was very much the French community of the end of the 19th century. But the French Canadians were not well received. The most prominent minister in this community wrote an article for a national magazine in the late 19th century, and these are his words. In England, all operatives have been trained in labor unions, and they established them here. They've been trained to make use of strikes, and most of the strikes in this country have been brought about by English spinners. The lowest class have been trained to think themselves hopelessly confined to their caste. They are imbruted, unaspiring, unthrifty. The majority of the English are large consumers of beer. The Irish are also numerous, and they are seldom of high grade. They are the least steady in their work. They drink whiskey. They are vigorous politicians with an eye to the spoils. The Canadian French are the latest comers, and on the average represent the lowest grade in the development of humanity. Those are the kind words. Now, but by 1900, about 46% of all textile workers in Massachusetts were of French heritage. And to get a sense of those that can read this, Massachusetts, of course, was peaking by 1900, and we had 26,000 plus workers, twice as many as Lowell, which is the closest to us. Again, it was the most important industry in the United States. Massachusetts was the most important textile state, and Fall River was far and away the most important city. The French-Canadian community was making tremendous contributions to this development. But Hugo Dubuque was infuriated because there was a stain that he thought might never leave the pages of history. For any good that Carol Wright had done in terms of helping us better understand the working class statistically had been compromised by the fact that there was a major section of the 12th annual report of the Massachusetts Bureau of Statistics of Labor, which was called the Chinese of the Eastern States. And the Chinese of the Eastern States were considered to be the French Canadians. The Chinese were not being tolerated racially. They were at that time the first group that was going to be excluded by law from entrance into the United States. And they had been brought from the West Coast by one Calvin Sampson in 1870 to Chicopee and had served as strikebreakers. So with the racial enmity, as we saw at the top of the lecture with the black youngster, we can see that the racism was worse than the ethnic prejudice. And here suddenly was, to most people of the French community, obviously great outrage. Now, there was no one defending the Chinese in 1882, but there were people defending the French community. And Hugo Dubuque of Fall River was a leader, an eloquent and forceful leader who connected with Father Pierre Bedard and other members of the Franco community. And they insisted that they have an opportunity to refute the calumny that the Mass Bureau had placed upon them. And they did so very effectively, and I think that Carol Wright proved to be a good sport. He opened up a hearing, he encouraged the hearing, and he gave the Franco community a full opportunity to defend itself. And there are many, many pages that are an interesting read. I still enjoy Hugo Dubuque's remark that I used in one of my books. He was critical of some people who get up in the morning and thank God that they are better than the rest of mankind. But it's an honor and a pleasure as a historian to have so many great primary sources in the 19th century. And this would be, I've marked it up a bit, but this would be typical of the kind of page, of the many pages that help the French community to defend itself. And basically, what it all came down to was, as Wright said, a misunderstanding. The Chinese were considered too mobile. They weren't going to be rooted in a community. And now the French were being accused of being birds of passage and wanting to go back to Canada, and that was making them the equivalent. Well, all Hugo Dubuque had to do was to show the statistical development in Fall River, that there had been 1,100 French Canadians in 1870 and there were 11,000 in 1880. So obviously more were staying than were going back, etc. And so this birds of passage concept was effectively refuted. He also spoke about the great law-abiding nature of the Franco community, and he showed the statistics. And certainly the Franco community was underrepresented in terms of arrests. Can't say that about the Irish. So in many dimensions, which I don't have the time to go into, is a very, very effective defense of the Franco community. And I think what happened was the French had tremendous skills, especially in using their hands and carpentry, etc. But they also had a professional class, such as Judge Dubuque. They had 8 physicians in Fall River by 1885, and they had a good group of middle-class business people that wanted them to sink their roots deeply. And so I think that's basically what happened. What time have we gotten to? I'm going too long. The thing that I haven't covered, and I promised my wife Jerry I would watch the length, but there's so many good. A lot of you know about the Notre Dame incident, right? I've written extensively about it, often called the Flint Affair. And this was the next challenge that the French community had. And that was an internal challenge. It wasn't like people from the outside were attacking them. It was fellow Catholics who were in conflict with them. And that was the historic difficulty between the Irish Catholic and the French Catholic community. And it sort of peaked at Notre Dame in the 1880s. And it was an issue where Father Bedard was the pastor. And he was a great builder of Notre Dame. But Bishop Hendricken, Thomas Hendricken, an Irish immigrant himself, Bishop Hendricken thought that the Catholic Church would be best accepted if all Catholics quickly assimilated and put behind any of their ethnic background. And so you had 2 different philosophies of what to do in the new country. And what basically happened was that Father Bedard died in 1884 unexpectedly, and at that time the bishop, Thomas Hendricken, replaced him with an Irish pastor. That did not go over well. But I just thought that I could show you a few. I mean, there's so much that makes us wonder about, I think, seriously about what kind of communications are taking place between Rome and the Catholic Church here in America on the hierarchical level. There was a lot going on during this Notre Dame dispute in the 1880s. Hendricken and Bedard simply didn't get along, and if you look at some of the archival records I've been able to get to, down here it says, those parishioners are so roused by one or the other priest that they make demands that are totally absurd. Consequently, if they should learn that their requests are received favorably from your eminence, it will be very difficult for me to govern them in the future. So again, this is Thomas Hendricken writing to Rome, saying, you have to let me control this situation or it will be very bad. Better one. The parishioners from Notre Dame de Lourdes approached the sacrament of penance. They have been denied absolution, he said. And in fact, the church was closed down by the bishop. He explained himself. Canadians have simply behaved wrongly. And so this is a very, very important point in American church history, even in foreign, but I think it had great impact in America. One of the last letters, I think, as I wrote on the top, the key letter came out of Rome. And the cardinal is writing to the Bishop of Providence. They, the French Canadians, weary me without end with their demands and complaints. And we must first have them ask for pardon. But in the end, they come up with, I think, a brilliant solution to the tension. The bishop could appoint a pastor from Ireland to head the parish, and at the same time give him an assistant of Canadian origin who would carry out the duties of the sacred ministry. So what's this all mean? What it means is that to save face, Rome decided to let Bishop Hendricken continue to appoint as pastor a person of Irish descent, but to bring in a French priest from Canada who had more experience. And that was the key, because everybody, I think, at that point knew who had won. So that within a short time, the Irish pastor announced that for reasons of health, etc., probably true, he was leaving Notre Dame. And at that point, the assistant pastor was elevated, the French pastor, and Notre Dame was proud. Now, the importance of that in terms of Fall River as an ethnic community is we get to the point where the Catholic Church is faced with the difficulty today of consolidation, and it's often painful. And I think that if we look back to the expanding times when we realized the building program that went on under a Bedard or Monsignor Prevost, the immense amount of money that it costs to build Notre Dame. I think the loss of Notre Dame is our most tragic loss in the sense that it defined the eastern section of the city. But most of all, it was spectacularly beautiful. And I think the interior artwork of the famous Cremonini, ceiling, etc., that I hope many of you had a chance to see. One of the things you're going to be delighted when the renovated library opens, something I never realized, but when you walk into the foyer of the library, there's paintings up above, and they're by Cremonini. So it's almost like a find, but it's just a modest little example of what Notre Dame is all about. I'll conclude by saying that, and I'm probably not going to find it, but I have no picture of St. Anne's Church. And I guess our challenge is going to be that inevitably St. Anne's may have financial difficulties. Father LaChance has been a wonderful model priest in that community, but the community is just diminishing in size. So I think at some point the city or we as citizens are going to have to face a problem, and that problem is going to be that St. Anne's truly represents the best architecturally, as Notre Dame once did. But it's more than that. It's a visual reminder that we all have ethnic pride, and we all achieved a great deal in Fall River. And so when the time comes, I hope, as you have rallied and come out in defense of Fall River history tonight, that we can all work together and make sure that St. Anne's Church remains viable for future generations. Thank you very much.